Vincent Canova, it's my pleasure to be able to have you with us today. I'm thrilled to have you with us. As a professional, as a beekeeper, you are in the Ardèche in France. It's a family-owned business, and it's this tradition of working with black bees. You are a member of different associations of these bees. You contribute in the magazine Bees in Freedom, and you always take time to share this with others. The title of your conference is Half a Century of Observation of Indigenous Honeybees in Extensive Beekeeping. Thank you, Vincent. I give you the floor. Thank you for this beautiful presentation. Thank you for this invitation. It's a very rich day. I hope that everybody, that other people will still yet be able to be invited. Yes, I'm a beekeeper. I'm a professional beekeeper. I work as in agriculture, and I have initiated associations, kicked off associations, and I am very implicated with the black bee preservation, and I will share about the history, what I've gone through. I'd like to first tell you a couple of things about who I am, and I'll take a little bit of time to speak of our farm, ecological beekeeping farm. And I will speak about the association that we founded in 2015, the Black Bee Association. And I will speak about the different practices in the heart. And I will as well give you some ideas, thoughts. I will quote a couple of researchers who have come to us. Briefly, who am I? This gives you an idea. I have learned to climb and in trees very early, from a very young age. This was my profession before I took over the family business. I would be a rock climbing person, secure roads, different areas, for example, anti-avalanche protections. It doesn't look like it as I'm on my skis, but I am working. I'm working with some young people. And since I had not very many hives, I would be transforming chestnut trees as well. And I transform my chestnut trees, a very multi-sided activity. I have sought to find and discover again the smells of my youth. So my main activity right now is working with my hives. Let's say a couple of words of this farm in the Gouttière. Got founded in 1972. In 1972, they started to with this activity, which was not very prevalent. A lot of bees in the environment very quickly. From the first year, they started to be involved with a certain association my parents were involved in beekeeping. This continues now. And the first 20 years of the honeybee activity, the gathering of bees at the end of the 1970s, end of 1970s. We had a lot of different colonies. 1980, about 100 colonies. Let's say in a radius of 5 to 10 kilometers around the farm, and reproducing. So now we have 500 hives, a model Dadon 12, and now 2020 we have in between 150 to 200 hives, different kinds. All these different colonies have been sedentary, 80% mobile. Only 2025 would be moved around within 20 kilometers radius at the bottom of the valley, so we could gather some different kinds, or confront them with different trees. What is the origin of these bees that we have inherited? About 1,000,000 years ago, Europe doesn't have this Apis mellifera bee. We have a hub of dispersion in the Orient, and that has enabled the bee making, the honey making bee to spread. And this will give an opportunity for refuge in the southern parts of Europe when glaciation came. And when the glaciation shrunk, not quite as drastic as what you can see on my slide, nonetheless, but these populations have, as it warmed up, at that point, we could see that the different lines involved and spread towards the north. And when the last time of the glaciation came down about 10,000 years ago, then again, they could take refuge in southern areas. 4 main refuges, which will give you the lines of the bees evolving. And from those different 4 lines of evolution, it'll give you a graphic ratio of this Apis mellifera. What we need to consider here is this long time of establishing with time. They have in each time adapted to their own area and specifics. And these bees have a genetic heritage. This is just a parenthesis. I'll come back to the historic of what we have done in Ardèche. I will speak about this in 3 main areas: the 21st years of the activity, sedentary colonies, black bees until 1990, 500 colonies, black bees, swarms and swarms and swarms everywhere, lots of swarms. You can see see this on this frame, the quality, even with a small variables, it was a very strong bee and viable, as we have seen it before. We even had colonies which would get established within thorns, and you could think, oh, there's maybe because of lack of habitats. What we have to know, we are in the chestnut area producing chestnuts. So we have ample offers for habitats. A very vigorous species. Sedentary was prevalent. Uh, we had very good production, very good production. As you can see, 40 kilos, very generous. The sugar during this whole time was not at all used in bee keeping practices, because we have an indigenous bee who homogeneous population, which is strong with a very low rate of mortality. What is important to take note of, we have swarming from June on. They coordinate themselves and they manage to put their focus on the flowers on the chestnut trees. And the colonies constitute their nest and stock. For example, this condemned window with a shutter which was mobile, we could recuperate these type of colonies many times. We had a rate of reproduction which was a very good quality reproduction. There was no question we would have never created these swarms. The rhythm of these bees are linked very closely with the surrounding trees. The beekeeping we are doing adapt to the bees. 1990 to 2010, it is a second, if you like, in the whole time. But in these years, there were very things, tremblings and uncertainty, which propelled us in many challenges because of a Varroa arrival, which was in 1988. There wasn't much transhumance back then. It took time until it got in our area. And sure enough, we had quite a pretty high mortality. So different lines had to be brought in, which weren't Apis mellifera. The first mortality which came in was 92, where we lost 200 colonies. Mortalities affected not only our own bees, but as well all the wild bees which are out there. Nonetheless, until at least the years 1980, Apis mellifera was still a wild species. This led to hybridation and led to less adaptive bees. And then we had had to import more bees. The questions come, the Varroa is still very present, and I think in Italy it comes up, and Varroa is still coming. A chemical fight has been necessary to get rid of these parasites. Yes, we had to treat, and sure enough, we had to start again, get rid of them, and have new molecules, thinking that we have found the right one, and then Varroa comes back again. So we notice that resistance does settle in, not only a problem because of chemicals being used, which have, even in biological, we can see that the waxes have been polluted, and varroa was not the only one. The pathogen, different, the Nosema serranaire, and all these different, all these little parasites, let's say, come to weaken. And we can say since 1980, we ended up getting caught up in a trend that we are having difficulty to counter. We have now big problems with our bees, and we need to remember the years 1980. But the main problems come from the neonicotinoids, which came in the 1995, and all these different polluants came in and modified as well the agriculture and the climate on top of it. Uh, all the resources have been difficult, and we could say it's a trembling or an uncertain time, which is indicated with the word vacillement. Another thing is the mobility. The transhumances have as well caused these problems because of the spreading with high mortality. The young queens are less vigorous. So the beginning of the use of the syrups to strengthen the queens, there's a hybridation, non-wanted, which happens because of transhumances. Reproduction is more hazardous as well. The swarming time, which was in June, which ends up being a 3 months of reproduction, which ends up having us lots of work, less appealing work, and a certain sense of artificial sides to things being much more prevalent, while before things were much more natural, with formerly a natural reproduction. So the beaker has to adapt to the bee. And so now we have a situation where the beekeepers has to find ways for survival. This time, let's say between 2010 to 2020, is not just for us a big problem, not just us. It's a general thing we notice overall. For on the agriculture, I'm been taking over some hives from the family to let them swarm, so I don't produce that much. I really try and give a chance for swarming to spread the different colonies, and hybridation, let more hybridation take place. But I still have this desire to work with the black bee, but I can tell it's just kind of escaping me. In 2014, we have, for the first time in our farm, we have a death in spring, and we have to use syrup and sugar so that they will survive. And that's the first time in 2014 that we use these on the colonies and not on the swarms. It was very nerve-wracking. I had already been trying to group people, pull people around me to find solutions and be sensitive to this, the disappearance of all of this. So with these difficulties getting bigger and bigger, so we have an association right now. We created the association in Ardèche as well nationally. And by chance, we were in contact with other different conservatories, and lots of people left and right are faced with the same problems, with problems of hybridation, all these things, and acceleration of the hybridation as well in the conservatories. So the same year, we created the federation with a goal to really be able to keep this black bee. Because for us, having a well-maintaining system, it seems very important to keep the bee, to research, experiment, and we, within these groups, we research. Because of Varroa, we used Happy Life for quite a long time. But then we were confronted with a certain amount of resistance in certain colonies, and we experimented as well of different ways of fighting Varroa. One of them is just not treating them at all, just to see what would happen. We have tried with all these different measures, acid formic, withdrawing the CV males to limit the pollution. All the big hybridation should not come and disturb the program of conservation. So to withdraw the males, it can keep the negative sides of the mixtures, the mixes to happen. So at the end of the season, we don't have to treat these colonies. The loxalic, more recently with glycerine, we are experimenting with that. Yes, we can speak of decline during this time, especially concerning the black indigenous bee. Decline doesn't happen everywhere. In France, for quite a while now, we can say 1,300,000 hives throughout France. But this amount doesn't take into account the genetic modifications which have happened to keep these numbers. So we really try to have a work of awareness by conferences, illustrations, albums, different articles, contributions. We have a school for beekeeping and as well this conservation plan to create a space where the black Apis mellifera can be regenerated. And we try and have a synergy with the different beekeepers and as well have genetic studies. In 2019, we conducted a work. I don't know if you remember, in 2019, it was a very vigorous time. In between April and June, the climate was disastrous. It was cold, wind, rain, and many colonies had a very tough time during that time. And we had many losses. So we started to feed the colonies so we wouldn't lose them all. But in 2019, more precisely the winter 2019, we had tried to obtain finances, public financing for this, to have genetic studies without success. But in winter of 2019, we decided to conduct these studies with so we conducted these studies, and so the season 2019 was a catastrophe, and we just conducted these studies, and you could just the comparison between two different hives, beehives. You have rucher 1 and rucher 2, where so beehive 1 and beehive 2. So in the first apiary and the second apiary, we can now present these results. And we have 13% on apiary 1 and apiary 2. The which in the apiary 2, it was mostly Italian bees. It was in the spring pretty difficult. We had to feed most of the bees in the apiary 1. They didn't get any feeding. The first was only in August or September, right before winter. And some colonies didn't receive any feeding in 2019. And the quantities of syrup that we had to give them was 22 kilos, 22 kilos by apiary. But it is an interesting, and then the apiary 2, which is hybrid bees. 16th of May and June, we had feedings as well later before the winter. We had 35 kilos of honey, but if you look at the ratio, 4 kilos of syrup for 90 kilos, you can see the 4 kilos for 1 kilos and 1 kilos for 5 kilos is the results. And you can find this under Nature&Progress, um, the newspaper, the publication we have. And we can see that these hives had been left, and we let them make their own their own necessary survival food. But what we can see, the 150 kilos was used. So the 50 kilos of honey was absorbed, let's say, during the summertime by these colonies, which didn't manage to regulate their population, and they were over consuming their stock, while in the apiary 1, it wasn't. Now in the apiary 2, it wasn't a very beneficial type of a situation, as you can see the ratio. But 2019, they would have not survived without the intervention of men. The Federation of the Conservatory of the Black Bee in Europe, they have regrouped themselves. So we have this European Federation of Conservation of the Black Bee. The objective is to preserve what still remains of our indigenous black bees, to preserve them in their natural habitat so that they would have a natural selection. We inform as well, as mentioned, as well. We are working towards the conservatoire having judicial recognition. Legislation is not really not satisfactory right now, so we have to work for that, to acquire that recognition. Then we've got the conservation specifications. We have an operational rules or charter, as well as a back bee celebration, and we have as well scientific research. And we need to move on. The federation is evolving, and everybody's very enthusiastic, and everybody wants to have this indigenous work. I would like to mention that in Europe, through this rally we have, you can join us. I'd like to mention a couple of things which are done in the heart area. In a conservatoire, a conservatory, what do we do is the sedentary of the colonies. What we are waiting for impatiently is swarming, which for us is always a very positive time. To have early or late harvest, which would be counterproductive. A selection, it's the bee being perfused, is something we do not want. As the drawing can see, the same thing, we don't want to go for the feeding, the nourishing, is something we do not want. We do not want the queens to be clipped, or this is something we don't want. In the conservatories, we wish to have a natural selection and sedentary and swarming being the way forward for colonies. Here is how we how we receive a swarm. It's not a big information, but this is how we work. These are natural swarms, and we have them in a frame. Two different kinds of frames can be used. They can be vigorous swarmings who don't receive any varroa treatment. Because what happens is these varroa treated have then children, and we do not want to lose the genetic. But the losses are not necessarily high if they survive through the winter. There's no visits to the nest, or they just weighed. And if the swarm has been built and have, if we realize when we weigh, we can at that manage to have an increase, even 15 kilos, while they are reproducing their own frames. So here we can see in front of the hives, you can see the different frames, which has been taken out. And then the natural royal cells are distributed. And then we have the original hive be taken away. And then we move away one of the hives, and we could be able to subtract some of the colony to strengthen failing colonies. This presentation leads me to suggest certain things. Sure, not all of them are there. So the question, how do we relate to the species? And what burden are we laying on the species? We need to think about these things within our own community of beekeepers, and maybe a responsibility too. I'd like to quote Valérie Chansigot. The story of domestication is domination by the humans on nature. There's two different models of beekeeping where we would say, well, bees are domesticated. 1880, let's say, when the people in Paris decide, let's have some beehives. But at that time, instead of being wild, they got to be called domesticated bees and bred. So this bee, we select it, we look for stability of hereditary elements, and we transform the bee breeding. But this can be seen as bee breeding while keeping it wild without being selective, which would give and lead to a partnership which would be viable. As soon as beekeeping has some selection, which is, for example, feeding with syrup, it goes against a sense of beekeeping, of conservation. A researcher in Montpellier challenges us to have not too many traces of the intervention of men in the developments of the bees. Is beekeeping limitless beekeeping? Is it viable? None of the 20 objectives we have been attained. So they really encourage us to reduce the intervention of humans on the wildlife, animals. Some ask the questions, people who are skeptical about the climate. Some are skeptical about the non-intervention with the bees, but it seems to me that we have become power men, superman, and we need to really be responsible as we go forward and be ready to reevaluate the ways we conduct our work in this area. Here's another quote. Back look is somebody who inspired later on the liberalism, let's say, in 1690, but back then already he was saying that as man acquires things, should always make sure that he leaves enough behind him for others. So we suggest to take action to protect the black bee no matter what. A good bee, a bad bee, to protect it, whether it's a good bee or not for the bees. But it seems to us that most of all, we need to protect the bees, black bees, and the bees at large, bees with which we work and exploit. But nevertheless, we need to protect it, to then multiply it, test it, use it, as long as we leave a good share, a necessary share for the environment. And I think FreeTheBees, the propositions they have, really encourage us to do so. And the benefits we will gain from this will be for all. Yes, conservation really give limits to an over exploitation, but as well create spaces for regeneration. So conservatories are places where all of nature can be as well left wild throughout Europe. I had to ask the following question. We are facing many obstacles, and they are important, and it makes our work very hard. We do have fears, and I know Enzo Bianchi says there's a lack of trust that we have. Humanity is confronting this lack of knowledge. And we have beekeepers who have arguments about the genetics of bees who clearly are not correct. CRS has demonstrated that. And some people have been more fatalistic. Hybridation is everywhere. We cannot do without, and that should not be a main concern. But the spirit we are in today of really control and measure nature, can we still divide it, control it, measure it? I do think that remaining in that kind of thought is not good, and is like a bomb yet to be exploding. So I'd like to quote two different things that have been published in 2018, and these have we have been with our conservatoire have been looked at as being strange people with unattainable goals. So this was quoted in UNAF, another one which speaks of itself, which are very hard things to hear. And these are spoken against the conservatoire, especially this author here reminds us that all the works of selection should benefit all beekeepers. and that was in 2018. And here we can see that men consider the species as belonging to him, over which he has the power of death and life. And I feel that there's a danger in looking at it from this angle. I think we should be able to welcome, discern, think globally in keeping an open mind. I will conclude now, suggesting that we have maybe failed to look and consider collectively beekeeping activity. We have not considered enough the species. We have not considered enough our neighbors, beekeepers, who are sedentary instead of the mobile systems which generate hybridation, and how this interacts with different species. Maybe these things disturb. We should be able to look difficulties head on. I would like to mention something referring to the woodpecker holes. So we had woodpeckers who explored, more than explored, some of our hives, beehives, destructed colonies. It was during the winter. This is one of the reasons why we defend the black bee, because the colonies of black bees stock honey when there still is a lot of honey, and no longer in highly hybridated colonies, the Italian types. If the bees could speak, maybe this is what they would hear. We are wild animals, and we need to be able to remain wild. In pink, our first goal is to pollinization, and not the production of honey in yellow. In blue, come along and walk with us, and do not show constraint on us. And we are called to consider the fact that bees are an evolving animal. Thank you, Vincent, for these words, for this presentation, these information on your work here. As other 5 speakers, Dr. Hugo Bucher, Dr. Fabrice Requier, Vincent Albouy, Mr. Yves Lecomte, all of you, thank you for participating. Thank you for the diversity we have experienced. And each one of you have been able to draw from your experience, and you've been able to share many things which have been listened to by a good more than 100 people, even though the weather is beautiful outside. I will give it over to André Villequier, who is working all the time. It's his passion. He's convinced of these things. He is André Vermelinger. Thank you for your work today. It's fantastic. Andre Dunant has organized everything. And thank you for being the moderator this afternoon. It was fantastic having you all.